Good evening. If we're ready, I'll call to order tonight's City of Santa Barbara meeting of Harbor Commissioners for February 18th. Jeanette, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, Bill Spicer.
Here.
Jim Sloan.
Here.
Betsy Kramer.
Here.
And Corey Bantolin and Stephen McIntosh are absent.
Very good. We have an intimate crew tonight. Mr. Reedman, any changes to the agenda?
Good evening, Chair Spicer. No changes to the agenda unless the commission wanted to. We had a brief discussion about changing the order of the items, but we felt it best to just leave the lease in between the two budget items to give Mr. Bossi a little breathing room. So I think, okay.
Very good. At this point, we open the floor up for public comment on anything not on tonight's agenda. I see that there does not appear to be anybody to speak on any of those items, so I will open and close public comment. We'll move to approval of the minutes.
So move. Second.
First and second, all in favor say aye. Aye. Minutes pass. On to department updates.
Well, good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Yesterday, I attended the first FY 2017 Council Budget Work Session at the Chase Palm Park Center. Finance Director Bob Samario and Paul Casey, the City Administrator, led the discussion and started with a real brief but broad overview of the enterprise funds of the city, including the airport, downtown parking, golf, solid waste, water, and wastewater, all of which. And then finally, the waterfront fund to wrap up with the enterprises. All of these other funds have some difficulties facing them. For instance, the airport, in the last 10 years, they've seen the flights drop from 45 to 21. They've had a major restaurant move out, but they've got a new one in, so that seems to be recovering, but less passengers. And so they've got some financial issues there. Downtown parking is in great shape, much like we are in terms of the good weather and all the people coming to town and parking. But most of their capital improvements have been handled in the past by the RDA, which is now gone. So they're going to have to start looking at building up some reserves or something for their significant infrastructure downtown. Similarly, it's no secret that golf, it's an enterprise fund within the Parks and Recreation Department, has had its well-publicized issues, and council has voted to privatize a portion of that, the pro shop and the maintenance of the course. And then solid waste is in a good position. Water and wastewater, though, everybody's doing what they're supposed to do, and they're conserving, so they're not getting the revenues that they need. So that's another discussion. However, Bob Samario was good to point out that the waterfront fund is solid in our we have reserves above our required policy, and we're in good shape. But the bulk of the presentation focused on general fund revenues, such as the recent softening in transient occupancy tax, that's the hotel bed tax, and also sales tax. They also discussed general fund expenditures and citywide capital improvement efforts. And there was a suggestion from the council. They liked our Harbor Patrol boat replacement fund that we enacted last year and will be putting into use this year, but felt that since we're having the good times now that we should probably up that amount of money that we're putting into that reserve fund. And so we'll be looking at that between this month and next month and bringing that to you next month. So the reason we had the meeting early last month was because I attended the California Marine Affairs and Navigation meeting in Marina del Rey in January, when we usually have the Harbor Commission meeting, and met with representatives from the Army Corps of Engineers, other harbor and port directors, and our city, the city's Washington, D.C. lobbyist, R.J. Lyerly of Carpy, Clay, and Smith. We were in a bad situation in the harbor shoaling in, and I was able to have good conversations with members of the Army Corps and also RJ, and they assured us that we would be getting some work plan money, some additional funding for our spring cycle, which did come to fruition, and Carl will talk about that in his report. So it was a productive meeting. I also had the opportunity to have lunch with Representative Manson Dredging, Manson Construction, and it was news to me, but they have bid on dredging in our harbor, but they can't compete with that little dredge that just sits there all the time because they've got to mobilize their big dredge and bring it up and back and up and back for force because we have two dredging cycles. So they just can't compete with a dredge that just sits here until it's needed. So that was kind of an interesting thing to learn about. And then tentative agenda items for the March meeting will be a fiscal year 2017 budget recommendation for your consideration and also a lease with Santa Barbara Water Taxi. And that concludes my report unless there are any questions.
Great. Any questions for Mr. Reedman? Well, thank you, Scott. Moving on to facility management report. Mr. Treiberg.
Good evening, Chair Spicer and Commissioners. We've all heard all about El Nino and the potential effects and the rain that we've all expected, and we haven't received any of that related to El Nino. But what we have received is an increase in large swells that have hit the harbor. The sand spit has been excellent for surfing many times this year, more than you'd normally expect. And it's great for surfers, but it's not so good for navigation in the harbor. We've had about 300,000 cubic yards of sand fill into the Federal Channel this winter since the fall dredging was completed in December. There's been rapid shoaling of the channel entrance. Several vessels have hit bottom, especially at low tide. And we've been monitoring it closely. We've done routine soundings by the Harbor Patrol and passed that information on to the Coast Guard and several others. The U.S. Coast Guard declared a safety zone at the entrance to Ventura Harbor earlier this year. They really had some serious problems. And we've been in discussions with them about doing that for Santa Barbara, but we haven't quite crossed that threshold yet. So we haven't done it yet. And fortunately, I'm here to tell you tonight about dredging that's coming up very soon. This is the type of work that our Harbor Patrol goes out, and they just take these soundings and just write down the information by hand, and we print that out and pass it on to some of the boating community. One thing that's kind of hard to see on here, but of significant note, is the channel right now is maybe 70 feet wide with a depth of about 6-7 feet. It's normally about 170 feet wide with a depth of about 18 feet. So that's a significant difference. It hasn't been that bad since 2014 when we didn't have any fall dredging and the harbor essentially closed in the spring. Fortunately, the Corps we contacted them several weeks ago. They agreed to go ahead and put the wheels in motion to begin dredging with their contractor, Pacific Dredge. They are issuing a notice to proceed tomorrow. Pacific Dredge is ready to go and mobilize. It won't take a whole lot for them to get ready, and they should be dredging Monday morning, first thing Monday morning. Dredging normally begins in late March and trickles into April, so we're 5, almost 6 weeks ahead of schedule, but we really need it. It's just about too late. Core dredging, typically, there's 120,000 cubic yards available by their regular contract for their maintenance dredging. As Scott mentioned, they received $380,000 in work plan funding, and they've negotiated a deal to dredge an additional 80,000 cubic yards. Work plan is a separate set of funds that's periodically provided by the Corps of Engineers for non-maintenance dredging. They did it a couple years ago in Ventura and Channel Islands when they had problems. Ventura, you may have read, they received $2 million for work plan dredging this year. So it's a great resource for us to tap into when we really need it. Just by way of comparison, in 2014, we dredged 250,000 cubic yards in the spring when the harbor was closed. So we have 200,000 cubic yards worth of funds. So we're just about at that. It should be adequate to get the harbor open, depending on how many swells we get for the remaining of the year, but hopefully we'll be in pretty good shape this summer. The large waves deposit a lot of sand in the channel, but they also scour the beaches and create a lot of erosion, especially along East Beach. In the fall, we generally discharge down by the Cabrillo Bathhouse, just up from there, and it tends to nourish that beach. But the beach further up towards Stearns Wharf and the Mission Creek Lagoon is really deficient in sand and is really eroded. That pipe was buried several weeks prior to several of the swells. So this cycle, we will dredge opposite the intersection of Cabrillo Boulevard and Calle Cesar Chavez. That'll nourish the whole beach, and once this is all done, all of East Beach should be restored for people to use and enjoy. One thing I'd like to note, as part of this project is the harbor condition is pretty marginal right now. Boats can get in and out, but we recommend that anybody who wants to go in and out contact Harbor Patrol on VHF 12 or 16 for information on the channel conditions or an escort. So we're doing our very best to make sure that the boating public is safe. My next project this evening is related to the replacement of Harbor Patrol Boat 1. Boat 1 is the real workhorse of the fleet. It was built in 1982 by Radden, a local boat builder. And back in September, we brought a proposal to the Harbor Commission to replace Patrol Boat 1 instead of repowering the boat like we had included in our capital improvement program. Earlier this year, we identified $110,000 to repower the boat and make some hull improvements. And as Scott also mentioned, last year we started this vessel replacement fund to the tune of $75,000 a year. So combining these together, we feel we could move forward with a replacement, and we presented that to the Commission in September with their unanimous approval. In preparing for putting up a bid package and specifications, staff spent an extensive amount of time visiting other harbors, looking at other boats, talking with different boat builders to put together specifications that we felt best represented the type of vessel we want to have in our fleet. We had two different options. One is with firefighting capabilities and one is without firefighting capabilities. As most of you know, we have many large and expensive wooden assets such as Stearns Wharf, the City Pier, the Travel Lift Pier, and Marinas 2, 3, and 4. So our preference is to move forward with the option related to the boats with the firefighting capability. We received 3 bids for the Boat 1. There's 2 different low bids for the 2 different options, but as I just mentioned, we're pursuing the option with the firefighting capability. Our apparent low bidder, the bid was rejected for not meeting some of the requirements in the specifications. I can't elaborate on that this evening. They have the opportunity to appeal that rejection, and so I'm assuming they would do so and there'd be a hearing, so I won't discuss it any further other than we're kind of wait to see how this works out with the city's purchasing division and one of the bidders. The low bids ranged from $198,000, that's the bid that was recommended for rejection, to $214,000. That's the next lowest bid. The available capital and vessel reserve funds of $185,000 doesn't quite get us what we need to cover the cost of the boat, regardless of which bidder finally is qualified and accepted. So we're requesting council approve an additional $40,000 as part of our mid-year budget adjustments that Brian will talk a little bit more about in just a little bit. And I'd just like to mention that this proposal was presented to Budget Subcommittee members, Commissioners Sloan and McIntosh, related to this. I will be giving you updates on the build of Boat 1 when it comes to fruition. It's a long build, almost 5-6 months, so it'll take quite a while once we finally issue a purchase order and set things going. And that concludes my presentation this evening. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Carl. I know there are a number of questions, but before we do, we have a speaker that would like to approach. Mr. Anderson?
Hi, my name's I'm here representing Anderson Custom Boats. We were one of the builders invited to bid on the Boat 1 replacement project, and I'm here to just say hello and put a face to the name. We've been in business continuously since 1982 and have built over 500 vessels, including a small fleet for the university system, harbor patrol boats, and a new lifeguard vessel for the Los Angeles County Parks and Recreation Department. And I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay. Commissioner Kramer, did you have a question?
Thank you, Carl, for the report. I had sort of questions when I was reading this here on the dredge. What will happen if they do not remove all the sand that comes in, or what happens if there are further storms after the cycle finishes? You
Sure.
say it's marginal now, and it's kind of concerning.
Chair Spicer, Commissioner Kramer, that's a good question. In the past, we've had similar situations where we've had to ask for more money, and the Corps has the flexibility of shifting funds from one program to another. We're hoping this is going to be adequate funding to get our channel open and safe for the summer, and knowing they're going to be back there again in the fall. But we'll stay in close contact with them. The Corps has been very responsive. They were more than willing to start early, and they did their best to go and get these additional funds. So we'll just keep our fingers crossed that we can continue that good relationship and get additional funding if we need it.
Do slip owners, and obviously I don't have a slip there, but do slip holders have an option of paying less if they can't have access?
No, that's never come up. Only once have they had really limited access, and that was last in 2014. I think it happened in 1983 also. So it's been a long time. This is a very uncommon situation, so we haven't had to face a harbor that was closed for a long time.
Thank you.
Commissioner Sloan.
Thank you, Carl. If they remove the 80,000 cubic yards, how deep is that? Is that going to get it back to the 170 wide by 18 deep, or is that somewhere in between that, do you think?
Chair Spicer, Commissioner Sloan, that's a good question. 200,000 yards probably isn't going to get the sand that's available. What we will do is we'll focus on those areas where there's the most shoaling and where navigation is most restricted. There are areas that are part of the template that are kind of out to sea that really you wouldn't notice if they dredged it or not. We're hoping that we're going to get very close to those dimensions for the most restricted part of the harbor.
Right.
There's parts of the channel that are kind of off to the side where there's some material that they rarely get.
Right.
But as soon as they're going to start Monday, we meet on Thursday, and on that day, we're going to look at all these different areas and prioritize where to dredge and how much to dredge out of each area. And they'll focus, and we'll go forward with that and then see how much additional sand we get from any additional swells we get.
Thank you. Is there a way to look at the contract that we have with whoever, any of the people that we might have in the future? And rather than do it on a cubic yard or quantity basis, do it on a daily basis or something? Some way that allows for some flexibility that if, we need a couple of days right now, but we might not need them in a year where we don't get a lot of storms or something, or have a contract where it's a set number of days of operation, but then there's a flexibility of adding a couple of days at no cost or, something like that, because, and what got me thinking about that was last time when you presented it, you talked about them bringing back the dredge that was rebuilt, and they seemed to be able to remove a lot more material in a day, or remove material faster than normal. And so it just got me thinking, is there a way to structure the contract somewhat differently? And I know it's not our contract, it's the Corps of Engineers, but I was just wondering what your thoughts on that might be.
We could certainly discuss it with them. A conventional Corps contract is they need a unit to pay against, and that's the cubic yard. What they've done in the past is they've taken the history of the material that's been removed and they've structured the future contracts based on that. We used to have 150,000 cubic yards per cycle. They've reduced it to 120. So Scott and I have already been suggesting that we go back to that 150,000 cubic yards. Part of the profit for these guys is the more sand they move in the less amount of time. It just so happens the new owner has really spent a lot of money and modified the dredge, so their profit margin's gone up considerably. We have had dredge contractors go bankrupt. So, but we could certainly talk about having some contingency whereby they'd be a little more flexible, especially in these kind of scenarios. But Scott and I think are going to lobby hard for getting that extra material in the contract right to begin with, so we don't have to go and look for work plan funds or go through these additional negotiations.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I could add to that, Carl and I discussed, and I know Carl discussed with the Corps, the possibility of, once they start dredging, they go 24/7. And in the last cycle, you'll recall that Carl reported, I think they finished in 6 days of dredging.
Right.
So that's great. But it also has a bad part, and that is if they're done before the end of February and we get a storm like we did in March 1st, 2014, we're done. So we did discuss the idea of can you dredge in 12 hours a day instead of go all night. But again, as Carl just said, the more sand they can move, the quicker they can move it, that's just money in their pocket.
Yeah,
so,
they have to deploy the team and
yeah,
all the
and
equipment
so
and everything that they don't leave here, and then they have to take it somewhere else. So,
yeah, so we tried,
Right,
but
right.
They weren't real warm to the idea of working half days instead of full days.
Yeah, I get that. Well, and you bring up a good point of contingency. Maybe there's a way to build in a contingency that the contract is for 150 or 180, whatever we can get it up to, but then have an opportunity to increase that for some lower incremental cost than redeploying all the equipment or something. And again, that it's the Corps' contract, so they have to be part of this, but just trying to figure out how to prevent this in the future.
Well, these are good comments, and they are going to renegotiate the contract this summer, so we'll certainly bring up those issues and see what they're willing to do to make sure that we're covered for future years where there's a lot of sedimentation.
Okay, and then I hate to
No, go ahead.
keep doing this. Moving on to the patrol boat replacement. The hearing with the bidder, who is that with, and when is it going to happen?
Chair Spicer, Commissioner Sloan, the city has a process where there are several city managers that are trained for these type of hearings, zoning violations and stuff like that. It's with the finance department, the purchasing division at this point. So assuming the low bidder requests an appeal, a hearing,
Okay.
yes, a hearing officer will be assigned.
Okay. So the process is the bidder has a certain amount of time to apply for a hearing?
5 days.
Okay, 5 days. And then where are we in that 5-day cycle right now?
Today is day one.
Okay. And so by sometime next week, that we'll know if there's a hearing or not. Then it takes about a week or two to get the hearing set up, or?
It depends. It can be pretty quick.
Okay. So by about the next meeting, we should have some sort of resolution?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Okay. That's what I was after. I was just after how long is this whole thing going to take?
Hopefully it won't drag out that long.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. I just had one quick question. You had mentioned a potential implementation of a safety zone. Could you tell me what that means?
Chair Spicer, a safety zone is a term that the Coast Guard uses. These are all federal channels, and they're regulated under the Rivers and Harbors Act. Ventura Harbor is no different. Ventura Harbor got so bad that they declared a safety zone where I think it was mandatory to contact the Coast Guard and the Harbor Patrol before anybody go in or out of the harbor and get authorization and have an escort.
Okay.
So we've discussed that with them. Mick and I have, and we haven't sort of pulled the trigger on that yet. And hopefully if they start dredging Monday, we won't need to.
Need to. Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate the report.
You're welcome.
Moving on to item number 4, harbor operations, and Mr. Cronman.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Well, with January 1st comes a whole slew of new laws in California, and one of them affects our boating community, all boating communities in the state, and it's related to personal flotation devices for children, or life jackets, as we commonly know them. Prior to the implementation of this law, children under the age of 13 needed to have a life jacket on vessels 26 feet or below if they were above deck, and they did not need to have a life jacket if they were below deck. Well, it turns out that especially up in the Delta area on the lakes and reservoirs where people go power boating, the power boats have gotten more powerful and longer and bigger, and so under considerable pressure from the California Sheriff's Association and sponsored by an Assemblyman Frazier up north who represents some of those counties in the Delta area, this bill was advanced. It's AB 638. I believe it's attached to your report here. Passed the legislature and was signed by Governor Brown. And so now any boat of any length, power or sail, with a child under 13, or 13 and under, excuse me, or it's under 13, I believe, needs to have a life jacket on if they're above deck. So the length limit has gone away. It's not just 26 and under. It's any powerboat, any sailboat, and I've attached the law to this, the bill, to your report, as I mentioned. And now it's in the Harbors and Navigation Code, so it is the law. Harbor Patrol is doing what they can to educate boaters about it. I'm here tonight. Hopefully this will get some traction and people will learn about it. I'm going to write about it in dock lines. We don't expect to have frequent contacts in this regard, but nonetheless, it's an important new law that folks need to know about, and it was advanced in the notion of protecting children at sea, boating safety for children. So, folks have any questions about it, they could certainly contact me. But like I said, the Harbors and Navigation Code will be amended to reflect this, and AB 638 will we can even put it online if folks want, but that's the operative assembly bill that was driving this law. It was actually an interesting lobbying effort between folks who didn't want to see it implemented. Certain recreational boating groups thought it was a overreach on part of government, and the Sheriff's Association, speaking for law enforcement and boating safety agencies, lobbied the other direction. They ultimately prevailed at the state level. I've spoken to you the last couple months about our crab fishery and where it's at, and I'm happy to report, as I did last month, the mainland remains open relative to domoic acid levels. The fishery is open, but the islands are still not open. Just there are a couple of tests that seem to keep continually testing hot, sometimes only one, but that's all it takes to prevent the reopening of the fishery. But there's good news on a couple fronts. One is the U.S. Small Business Administration has actually declared an economic disaster related to not only the closure of the rock crab fishery, but the postponement and in some places the closure of the Dungeness crab fishery to the north of us. And while our fishery is very, very important to our local fishermen, some fishermen have actually gone out of business, especially new crabbers. We're just getting into the business, invested in traps and gear and boat and what have you. It's been very, very hard on them. To the north of us in the Dungeness crab fisheries, and especially in San Francisco Bay and other highly populated areas, it's been extremely devastating. Hundreds and millions of dollars have been lost, not just to the fishermen, but to the wholesale and retail chains and the restaurants and all the way down the line, the processing houses and what have you. So in that regard, the Small Business Administration has set up several meetings up and down the coast to work with fishermen to apply for low-interest loans through the SBA, typically around the 4% level. And they'll be here next week on February 21st and 22nd. They'll be meeting in the community room on the north side of the waterfront building. Most folks, if they don't know where it is, they can always call me. I can direct them. But they'll have folks there explaining the process, SBA representatives actually helping folks with applications if they need them. And some of these loans can be a considerable amount of money with long term. So there may be individuals, that have long-term interests, like getting back in the fishery, quite frankly, who may have an abiding interest in attending these meetings on the 21st and 22nd. And in addition to that, on February 9th, the Governor Brown wrote a letter to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce requesting that a fishery disaster be declared, again, relative to both the Dungeness fishery and the closure of our rock crab fishery. And if the Secretary of Commerce declares a disaster, much like salmon disaster has been declared in the past when there were weak runs of fall Chinook up in the northern rivers in California, and there was no commercial fishery at all, they declared a fishery disaster. And what this does, if Commerce declares this disaster, it will open up other avenues of economic assistance to folks affected by this. And I will certainly report back to you next month on that. So one minor correction from my staff report. Since I wrote this report, the contacts, the PIO contacts and the general contact for program details on the SBA loans has changed. It's on the screen here. And I will also send it to our email listserv for fishermen. I will do that first thing in the morning so they have that, so they can spread the word and the information before the meetings begin on Monday and Tuesday. So that concludes my report this evening, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Cronman? Thank you, Mick. We will move on to new business.
Item number 5.
Thank you.
Fiscal year 2016 mid-year budget report. Recommendation that Harbor Commission receive and review a status report on the Waterfront Department fiscal year 2016 mid-year budget revenues and expenditures.
Mr. Bossy.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Tonight is obviously a budget-heavy evening. Usually we would bring this report to you in January. However, with our new financial management system at the city and a number of other factors, these numbers weren't available on time, at least for us to actually get in and analyze them and put some cohesive information together. So we are here tonight with you. And this is our mid-year budget review. So last year about this time, the Harbor Commission recommended that the City Council approve a 2-year budget program for the waterfront. It was part of a citywide process. And so we're approaching the kind of the midway point of that 2-year budget. But this is for our first 6 months of that first fiscal year. So July 1st, 2015 through December 31st of 2015. Now, this is there are a number of things going on up here. This is our year-end revenue projection. So you have your program on the far left column. You have our budget numbers for fiscal year 16. That's what was approved by Harbor Commission and the City Council. Then we have our actual year-to-date, so that's through that July through December timeframe. And then using the next column, we use at least a 3-year seasonal average to project out where we're going to be at year end. And it's usually pretty darn close. And then the final 2 columns are the year-end variance in dollars and then the year-end variance in percent. So as you can see here, our property management program is doing quite well at 7%. And this is all our leases, amongst other things. Our financial management program, this again is funds that are in the control of our finance department. We're down a little bit, about 1%. As we project out, we'll be down about 1% at the year's end. As far as parking services are concerned, we continue to have strong parking numbers, and we're looking at about a 3%, finishing about 3% over our budget. And then finally, in marina management, it's looking like we will be just under our budget numbers. And a good part of that is likely due to a slowdown in our slip transfer fees. As you can recall, last year we had fiscal year 2015 was a banner year pretty much on all fronts at the waterfront. Our property management, our parking services, our marina management, we saw unbelievable numbers as far as slip transfers were concerned, almost double of what we had budgeted for, and we've never seen anything like that. And so this particular spreadsheet, or chart I should say, now I'm moving into comparing it to fiscal year 15. So last year at this time versus this year, where are we at? How does it compare? So remember, again, fiscal year 2015 was a banner year as far as revenues were concerned. And as you can see here, overall, we're still doing quite well. We're going to meet our budget numbers. So property management is down not quite 2%, and our financial management is up almost 30%. So that's odd, but we'll take it. Our parking services, again, even with last year being a great year, it looks like we're continuing to improve on our parking. And then marina management, this is where you can really tell where those slip transfer fees have dropped off since last year. That $347,000, or the 10%, is basically almost all from a difference in our slip transfer fees from this year to last year. But looking back, if you were to take out the anomaly of fiscal year 2015 and the slip transfer fees, we're right on target with every other year in the past 5 years. So we're still looking really, really good. And as Scott reported earlier in his meetings, we're happy to be where we are financially. That's for sure. Now, as far as expenditures are concerned, again, through the mid-year point, overall, you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner, we're at about 54.77%. So not quite 55%, 50% of the way through the year. And most of the categories on your left are below the 50% mark at the halfway through the year. There are a couple that are not. You'll see transfers to capital, and that's because once we hit that July 1st marker, we start moving a lot of money around, approved funds to start those capital programs and get up and running on our capital projects. You also see that our principal and interest, as far as our debt service, those are front loaded in the first 6 months of the fiscal year as well. So that's why those are above that 50% mark. But sum total, we're at the 50, just shy of 55, so we're looking pretty good as far as fiscal year 2016 is concerned. And on all fronts, both the revenue side as well as the expenditure side, which you see here, by year, fiscal year end, we do plan on meeting our revenue numbers and hopefully coming in below, which seems like we always do on our expenditure numbers. So we're looking pretty good. I think the salary and benefits, one reason that's usually right at 50%, but we've had a number of retirements on our Harbor Patrol. So you get folks who are retiring who are at the top step, and a younger crew coming in who enters the Harbor Patrol at a significantly lower step on the pay scale. So that's where I would imagine that 3 or 4% comes from. So with that, all in all, things are looking good. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have about the mid-year budget review. I should note that the attachment that is part of your Harbor Commission report gets into a line item detail as far as revenues are concerned and compares this year, year-to-date, versus last year at the same time. And with that, again, sorry, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Bossy? Commissioner Sloan.
If you go back to that last slide for a minute. In the supplies and expenses, why is that up? It looks like it's about $170,000.
So supplies and expenses are things we're putting out. Allocated costs for what we pay for city services, other city services. So with supplies and expenses, give me 1 second to pull up my notes. A lot of numbers up there going through my head. So it just helps if I can look into it. Yeah, one big part is our Work Inc. Program, which is encumbrances about $245,000, $250,000 a year. And so at the start of the year, that's immediately encumbered, so it's there for the rest of the year. So that's a big component of it. And then also, it's a lot of smaller things that add up over time. But the big one for that is definitely the Work Inc. And that you'll see that year in and year out at the mid-year report, that Work Inc. Again, having them, we get that going right up front at the first start of the year.
Okay. And that's probably what it is. I was looking for something large like that, not just a whole bunch of little things.
Yeah, and generally we do really well on our supplies and expenses. We come in under. But again, that's a front-loaded one. I should have mentioned that along with the principal on interest and other items.
Great, thank you.
Brian, my compliments and to the whole department, Scott, as far as coming on target. You did mention a number of times slip transfer fees and how that is always a wild card for prediction. And can you walk us through again how you come up with that number when you're doing your projection?
The truth? No.
Yes, I'd be happy to, Chair Spicer. We look at previous years. Again, we look back 3, 5, 6 years. We have data going years and years back. And so what we do is we try to assess where the economy is at, how things are going on here locally. Obviously, we have a fully subscribed marina. People love to be down in the harbor, but in a lot of cases, it is just a guess. And we've come to about a solid number of about 575, 550,000 on an annual basis, and it seems to work out quite well. We seem to hit that number, if not exceed it. Obviously, last year we were over the $1 million mark. We're still seeing, again, this year a very active slip transfer program, just not quite as robust as last year. Through the first 6 months of the fiscal year, we've had a total of 30 slip fee transfers, which is about right. We usually have about 60 to 65 on an annual basis. And Mr. Cromnan, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I was just going to add, Mr. Chair, that this year we seem to have had a higher percentage of smaller boats through the first half of the fiscal year, which tends to influence this number as well. And so that's all I would add on that.
Yeah, and to further that, Mick's exactly right. We've had about 20 transfers into 30 foot and below, and then 10 from there and above. So about a 2-to-1 ratio. So he's right on target with that.
Well, thank you. And the only reason I ask is to illustrate the difficulty and really the art that you do on projecting that number and how well it's done. So my compliments. Okay, we'll move on to item number 6. Jeanette?
Item 6, proposed lease agreement with the Blue Water Hunter. Recommendation that Harbor Commission review and recommend City Council approval of a 5-year lease agreement with Andrew M. Taylor, a sole proprietor, doing business as the Blue Water Hunter, at an initial base rent of $2,430.50 per month for the 878 square foot lease space located at 117D Harbor Way.
Mr. Bossy.
Good evening, Mr. Chair. This is the Blue Water Hunter lease. Located at 117D Harbor Way, the Blue Water Hunter occupies approximately 878 square feet of commercial space. You can see it here. It's squeezed in between on the alley and our maintenance folks, their workshop. This is Mr. Taylor on your left. This is a few shots from inside the shop. And Mr. Taylor he's significantly upgraded the space in the last 18 months even. You continue to see new offerings in the space. He has a large variety of wetsuits, masks, fins. He refills air tanks. He's got a good comprehensive repair service as well. Andy brings over 30 years of spearfishing experience to the Blue Water Hunter. He's owned and operated the Blue Water Hunter for almost 20 of those 30 years. And he can assist everyone from the beginner to the expert with local knowledge, trip ideas. He can find charters for you and everything else you need to have a great spearfishing and diving experience. And the recent improvements, again, he has done a wonderful job. It's great to see the activity there. We've had, for the most part, really nice calm seas, and so people are coming, more and more people are coming to his shop, and we're happy to see him down there and doing well. As for the terms of this proposed lease, we're proposing a 5-year lease term with an initial rate of $2,430.50 per month. He does receive, like all of our tenants, a cost of living increase annually. And he is subject to percentage rent, and that's variable depending on what type of sales activity is taking place at the store. So again, Mr. Taylor's done a great job improving the facility. It's really making its mark here on the waterfront area. He's a tenant in good standing, and he pays on time, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Any questions? Commissioner Sloan.
So what's the current rent?
The current rent should be just below the $2,430.50. So what we do in situations like this is generally just roll that rent into a new proposed agreement, right, because, again, it will go up annually with that CPI increase. So we just kind of, unless it's severely out of whack, right, then we'll change it. But with this particular space, it seems to be...
So this is just following the normal progression of what it would be with the CPI.
Exactly.
And then a 5-year term with no options?
This was, obviously we like to have our tenants there as long as we can have them, especially when they're good tenants.
Especially
this was something that,
20 years.
Yeah, this is something that Mr. Taylor was more than comfortable with.
Okay.
You never know in an industry like this what's going to happen. It is a unique industry. It's a niche industry. He's competing with the internet. So hopefully he's developed and we think he has a nice little niche space down there that people will continue to come to.
That is one of the key and important business in our harbor.
Definitely.
I'd like to add, if I may, it hasn't always been easy for Andy down there. And it was, he had a bit of a slow start, but he does have an internet presence. And with the closing of Anacapa Dive Center, he is, other than over at the Truth Aquatics boats over at Sea Landing, I believe he's the only air compressor presser left in town. So it hasn't always been easy for him, but he's really turned the corner in the last, like Brian says, the last year and a half or so. We're seeing more inventory and
Yeah, the shop looks a lot nicer than
things.
it has. And
Yeah,
there
it
is
was a
more
little.
inventory in there. And
It was a little spare before, but he's doing a good job.
good. Okay. Then I'd move.
But
Oh, I'm
One second.
an option would be to his benefit. I mean, wouldn't it? An option to renew?
That's a good question. It kind of depends on where you're coming from. Again, as Scott said, this hasn't always been easy for him.
I appreciate that.
5 years is a comfortable time frame for him. I think he doesn't want to get too overextended. In 5 years, do I expect to be here doing this again? I sure hope so, and I think Andy does too. But I think 5 years is a good, comfortable space for him if he needs loans and things like that. He can acquire
I
those.
mean, if he wanted to renew in 5 years, it would be some sort of guarantee or promise that the rent wouldn't be jacked up too high.
That's a great idea. And what we do is when somebody like Mr. Taylor has finished up a 5 or a 10-year lease and he's in good standing, it's in our best interest, if they still want to be in that particular space, to continue to roll that out to them. We like to stick with the people who have been a good addition to the harbor and the waterfront area, which he has, and so we like to continue that.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Sloan was going to advance the.
Move to approve it.
Second?
All in favor, please say aye. Aye. We all said aye. It approved unanimously. Thank you. Item number 7, and I believe that's our last one for today.
Yes, item 7, budget overview for fiscal year 2017. Recommendation that Harbor Commission A, receive a report on the status of the fiscal year 2017 waterfront operating and capital budget, and B, provide comments on the various components of the draft budget proposal.
Mr. Bossy, did you get a drink of water there?
I'm good. I'm ready. Good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. So switching gears from the last financial report, we're going to move into fiscal year 2017. And again, last year at this time, the Commission as well as City Council approved a 2-year budget. So generally, when we come to these mid-cycle budget updates, the hope is that there's not a whole lot of change to take place. We like to nail it down as much as we can with those 2-year budget approvals. So what you're going to see tonight are generally numbers that we had previously, but with some small tweaks here and there. And we are continuing to get information. So over the course of from now until next month, these numbers might change, but I don't anticipate huge changes in what you'll see next month. For one, we're very conservative when we project out our revenues. We are an enterprise fund, and so therefore we don't get any support from the general fund. And so we really have to be smart as to how we approach our revenue projections as well as our expenditures and how those two work together. So as far as an outline, I'll very briefly go over our summary of fiscal year 16 revenues and expenditures. In case you forgot from a couple minutes ago. Then I'll go over our proposed, which I might have, our proposed fiscal year 2017 fee adjustments, our proposed revenue assumptions, our proposed expenditures, and then go over our council-approved capital program, which, again, was approved as part of our budget last year. Okay, so fiscal year 2016 to date, this is a down and dirty summary of what you just saw. Revenues, we're a little over $7.7 million. Our projection is we're going to come in about 3% over our budgeted estimates. As far as expenditures, we're right on target, as I showed, about 54, almost 55%. And our expenditures, I do anticipate that we'll come in below that 13.8 mark, unless something strange happens between now and then. And again, when we look at these things, we are an enterprise fund, so we are entirely dependent on lease rents and user fees to maintain our operations as well as maintain our emergency and capital development reserves. So again, we approach it with significant caution. So our proposed fee adjustments for fiscal year 2017, the first one up there is our slip rental fee. This is, we are requesting a 2% increase, and this is per our Division of Boating and Waterways loan, which is funding our Marina One project. This is part of the agreement. And so again, 2%, this is similar to what we've had the previous 5 or 6 fiscal years. Our slip transfer fee, this is something that we generally move up on a sliding scale on an annual basis. In the past, when it gets to a certain point, the Harbor Commission has frozen a number of those fees. For example, the Harbor Commission froze the transfer fee for 20-foot slips, I believe back in 2003, 2004, and froze the 25-footers in, I believe it was fiscal year 13, just a few years ago. So this year we're proposing, we're at that point again, and Mick might want to expand on this a little bit if need be. We were proposing to freeze the 28-footers as well as the 38-footers, and also our designated commercial fishing slips, primarily located at the Marina 1A finger, as well as our fishermen floats both north and south. And before I started this slide, I should have let you know we did meet with our the Harbor Commission's budget subcommittee on February the 3rd and discussed all the items you're going to see before you tonight. There might have been a few changes in there, but they have been apprised of where we're at. Continuing on with our fee adjustments. So I told you about the ones we're proposing to freeze. For the slips above 30 feet, we would do the standard 25-foot increase, which again we do on an annual basis. Our liveaboard fee. We are proposing to increase our liveaboard fee from $140 a month to $150 a month. This would be the first such increase since 2004. And again, when we look at all of our fees, we don't want to get in a situation where a number of other harbors have been, where they just don't increase them on an annual basis, and instead, 10 years down the road, they look at their financial figures and go, "Oh wow, we're way behind." I know one particular marina down south in San Diego County had to increase their slip fees 1 year 30% across the board. So that did not make for very many happy meetings of their Harbor Commission. So we'd like to avoid that and provide smaller incremental increases if need be, and only if need be. Cruise ship fee, this is a new one. This has been a discussion between Mr. Reedman as well as our administrative analyst, Dominique Samario, with the various cruise ship lines that frequent Santa Barbara. Our current program is we charge $5 for both the passengers, for every passenger, as well as for every crew member. So it's the combined manifest of that cruise ship. We charge $5 for everybody, whether they come off the ship or not. In talking with the cruise ship industry, their preference is instead to switch that and make it a $7 per passenger only fee. So the crew they wouldn't have to pay for the crew. Generally, you don't see the crew getting off. So what happens is they aren't able to, when it's a crew fee, they aren't able to pass that through to the passenger. However, with this particular fee just going towards the passengers, they'll be able to put that in as part of their budget and as part of the overall cost of a cruise ship, a cruise ship vacation. So when we do the numbers, it comes out right about the same, if not a little to our advantage. This is an important source of revenue, not only for the waterfront, but for a number of our tenants, as well as the entire downtown, as you heard last month. So this is something that we feel we can live with. And again, it was part of a negotiated process that Mr. Reedman, as well as Dominique Samario, took on. So those are our proposed fees for fiscal year 2017. As far as our revenue assumptions for fiscal year 17, again, we go into this very conservatively. We look at where we're at halfway through the year, the previous fiscal year, where we're projecting out to be. We look at our seasonal averages. And again, we proceed with caution. So you're seeing with property management, we're proposing a 3% increase for revenue estimates. Financial management, we're never quite sure where that's going to come in. That's obviously market driven. So we're proposing, I believe finance has put forward a slight decrease of about 2%. Parking services, again, being conservative, we're looking at possibly a 1% decrease in our revenues. The main component of that, and it's mentioned in your Harbor Commission report, is all the construction at the base of Stearns Wharf. Most of our lots are doing really well. One of the few that isn't is our Stearns Wharf parking. You've got a tremendous amount of construction down on Lower State Street, the Funk Zone, the Entrada project. You've got part of Cabrillo Boulevard closed off. Access to the wharf is being inhibited. And so over the last 6 months since those projects really started to take shape downtown and squeeze off traffic lanes, we've seen a decrease in automobiles being able to go out onto the wharf to the tune of about 9,200 fewer automobiles than from the prior year at that same time frame, which is significant. That's a lot of automobiles, considering we get about 250,000 a year. We've also seen a decrease in pedestrians over the last few months where the construction really started to take place as well. It's interesting. Our pedestrian numbers are similar this year as to what they were last year, but the last couple months of pedestrians have seen fewer, about 7,500 fewer. So it's really just the last couple months. We're hoping that'll change. We continue to work with our Public Works Department and their staff to see if there's any mechanisms to make it easier for especially autos to get out onto the wharf. So it's a constant dialogue we're having with them. Derek Bailey, the traffic engineer, is doing a great job trying to work with us and get people out there. He comes to our merchant meetings, so he's very well of the frustration that some of our folks are having out on the wharf. So we're hoping to get more people out on the wharf. But again, comparing it to fiscal year 15 is a bit of it's tough because it was such a great year. As far as marina management, nice conservative increase of about 2% in revenues. That's what we're moving forward on. As far as expenditures, overall, again, you'll see a description on the left here. Our fiscal year 16 budget in the second column, what we're currently proposing for fiscal year 17, and then what that percentage change is, 17 compared to 16. Again, these numbers might change over the course of the next month as we continue to work with our finance department, but I wouldn't anticipate too major of changes as far as this is concerned. Salaries and benefits, that's a factor of memorandums of understanding that are going into effect on July 1st. I believe it's a 3% for generals and a number of other percentages. So that's why you'll see that percent. Our allocated costs, that's a big one there, $100,000, and about, I believe it's $75,000 or $80,000 of that is due to insurance costs throughout the city, and so our portion of that goes up by about $75,000. So that's the big chunk there. Our supplies and services, looking to increase a little bit as well, and that's for some smaller supplies and things, smaller but very much important, including some signage program improvements that you'll be seeing the last half of the fiscal year, in addition to some you'll be seeing shortly, as well as increase in credit card fees. Again, we have the Luke Pay on Display system, a lot more people using debit cards and credit cards. You'll also see about approximately $50,000 as part of a Harbor Patrol locker room improvements. So that's the increase there. As far as community promotions, a slight increase of about $4,000. We usually come in under for that. Our transfers to capital, that's just depends on what kind of capital projects we're running for that particular year. Our non-capitalized outlays, these are proposed to increase by about $35,000, and that includes Harbor Patrol needs new weapons. We've got an aging group of weapons, and most of them about 16 years old. So they need replacing, much lighter, much more efficient, just a better safety mechanism for our folks to have. And obviously safety is a big thing for us. Also, new self-contained breathing apparatus, and that's for our firefighting endeavors, for our Harbor Patrol, in order to be in compliance with our fire department standards. So they're going to be getting some new equipment there, which is always a good thing. One good thing you'll continue to see is a reduction in our principal and interest payments. That was with your approval as well as City Council's approval, the payoff of the general fund loan. And so we do see a decrease in expenditures there, about $100,000 a year. So sum total, about 3% increase. Not too bad. Again, happy with our revenues. We generally come in under as far as our expenditures are concerned. So as Mr. Reedman mentioned in his director's report, we're, again, happy to be where we're at. As far as proposed capital program, I shouldn't say proposed, it's actually misstated. It was approved last year. We've got your Marina One replacement project. That's phase one, and that's about $1.7 million, and that's the Division of Boating and Waterways loan. Stearns Wharf timber pile replacement, that's an annual program. Our Marina renovation program will continue to work on redecking Marina 4. Our Harbor ADA restroom remodel, that is Marina number 2, so they'll be seeing a brand new restroom there, which I'm sure is welcome to those folks, and it'll be a huge improvement. Marina 2, 3, and 4 entire replacement, that project will move forward at $150,000. We also have a repower of Harbor Patrol Boat number 2. That's $130,000. Our ADA handrail repairs will focus on the handrails between Marinas 3 and 4. We're getting a few more years and we'll be done with that project. And then our parking lot maintenance repairs at $85,000. Those are going to focus on our Ledbetter parking lot. Obviously, a very heavily used parking lot, not only for our residents, but also our agreements with City College folks. So that is the capital program as it now sits. And that is the end of my presentation. Again, you'll get more defined numbers in the next month. We'll be putting forth the proposed budget for fiscal year 17 and any further tweaks. So we're really dialed down in the next 4 weeks to make it as solid as we possibly can and work with our finance department to do so. Happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Bossy? Commissioner Sloan.
Can you refresh me backing up to the facilities management report? We talked about the Powerboat 1 replacement being more than we had in there, and where did that show up in these two reports?
Chair Spicer, Commissioner Sloan, $110,000 is an FY16 for Boat 1 for what we were going to repower. We've also got $75,000 in the newly created Vessel Reserve Fund.
Right.
So combining those, we've asked Council to appropriate the $75,000 to the capital fund. So that gives us $185,000 for this fiscal year 2016.
Okay. So it's just reallocating some funds, but that's going to leave us short even still, isn't it?
Well, it'll draw the Vessel Reserve Fund down to zero at the end as of June 30th.
Right.
Starting July 1st, that fund will begin to accrue again, another $75,000. If we repower Boat 2 for $130,000, by the end of next year, there'll be $75,000 in the Vessel Reserve Fund, another $75,000 the following year. So hopefully it'll accrue and we won't transfer those funds to the capital fund, assuming the repower program goes as planned. The repowering Boat 1 and turning it into a replacement was a deviation from what we had proposed originally.
Right. So two things on that. One is our bids were somewhere between 198 and 214, so we're still going to be 20,000 shorter.
Yeah. So for FY16, as part of the mid-year budget adjustments, we've asked Council to appropriate $40,000 out of our capital reserve fund, out of our reserves, into that specific project.
Okay. And that's what my question was. Where does that show up in this?
It would have shown. It shows up in the FY16 mid-year budget adjustments. This is FY17.
No, I understand that. So backing up to the 16, was that in there, the additional $40,000 for capital?
I believe in our mid-year report to the our written report to the finance department, I believe we mentioned we requested the $40,000 be added to.
It wasn't in tonight's presentation,
No.
but it's in the council report.
Right. Okay, so second part of that question is, so we have the Repower Patrol Boat 2. Is that now going to turn into the vessel replacement fund, or?
No, this is all out of the capital fund.
Right.
So assuming we can repower Boat 2 for $130,000, that'll just draw down that amount of money out of the capital fund, which will be transferred to the capital fund from our reserves. And the vessel reserve fund will just continue to accrue at $75,000 a year. I think Scott had mentioned council's interested in perhaps increasing that, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and bring that back to the Harbor Commission.
Okay, so where would that show up? Would that show up in the reserves? It's not showing up in our CapEx.
No, it'll show up as a reserve, as separate independent reserve fund.
So we'll have the Harbor Preservation Reserve. That'll be a third reserve that we have?
It's been, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Sloan, it's been set up kind of like a reserve fund, but it's programmed in our 2017. The $75,000 is in there for the vessel replacement fund. And there's a good possibility after we meet with the finance department and the city administrator later this month or early next month, March 3rd, that we may come back to you next month with $100,000 or maybe $150,000 of an annual vessel replacement fund, so we can grow that while times are good.
Right.
But the 75 is in this budget.
Does it make sense to merge these two, the vessel maintenance, which is repowering or whatever, and the vessel replacement? Because what we just saw was we had to take some out of the engine replacement to go to buying the new boat. So does it make sense just to, like you said, do $50,000 a year for, boat replacement or engine replacement? Or I'm sure we could come up with something to call it.
The difference is, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Sloan, Boat 1 it's a 20-foot boat, and Boat 2 is 30 feet or so. So it's several orders of magnitude more expensive than.
Right. Yeah.
So we were able to get Boat 1 within that by taking our vessel replacement and what we had allocated. It wasn't planned that way. We were going to repower it, but we looked at it, and with the $75,000 and the $110 we'd programmed, we were pretty close to just replacing it. So we said, 30-year-old boat, let's replace it.
Right.
We're going to have a few more years of accumulating in that fund before we get near to doing Boat 2. Otherwise, we wouldn't be throwing money into two new engines.
Right. And my suggestion was just combine the two. We know we're going to have to replace more vessels in the future, and we know we're going to have to do capital improvements to these vessels, like replace engines and things like that. And so does it make sense to have two different funds, or combine them and just call it vessel?
Commissioner Sloan, we used to pay for repowering out of our operating expenses.
Right.
And we realized that they're quite expensive and they should be capital outlays. And so that's how we kind of approached the repower component, knowing that the replacement is so expensive, especially for boats 2 and 3. We're talking $500,000 or more.
Right.
So the concept of the vessel reserve fund, allowing it to accrue gradually to where we could replace the boats and kind of keep them running with a repower program through our capital program. That was kind of the logic behind the whole thing. The vessel reserve fund is actually a transfer out of our operating budget to the vessel reserve fund. So there's no kind of net loss. The idea is taking that operating expense, capitalizing it, and using some of it to a future reserve fund. So we're kind of getting to the same place that you're suggesting, just in a little different manner. I believe we're kind of going in the same direction as you suggest.
Okay.
I
As
think
long
we
as
are.
we continue to have some flexibility, that if we need to borrow some from one to.
Yeah. This is our first year of the vessel reserve
Right,
fund,
right,
so
right.
these are good
Yeah.
questions, and
We'll
we'll adjust as necessary.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, Commissioner Kramer.
I have a question about transfer fees. Thanks for, I don't know why I'm thanking, but I think it's a good idea to freeze the ones, the smaller size boats. But what's the explanation for raising them at all for 25, on the 30-foot and above? And I'll note that I don't see anyone here complaining about it, but I think it should be noted.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Kramer, as you may recall, the whole purpose of a transfer fee is it's a dual purpose. One is to make folks pay for the privilege of direct access to berthing in Santa Barbara Harbor, which is public berthing, and as opposed to being on the waiting list or what have you. It's also a means of the waterfront department, or the city, if you will, being able to gain back some of the revenues being transacted in the underground market for what is essentially a municipal resource and really just a parking place in the harbor, which we call a slip. And so what we've done over the years is we've been tracking what we believe to be the general value of those underground transactions, and especially the transfer fee is expressed as a percentage of that transacted fee between private parties. And as that percentage starts going up and up and up, what it does is it does what actually the whole transfer program was intended to do, and that is dampen investment in public in a municipal resource, being slips, as an investment. And so when we see that we're getting close to achieving that goal, where people aren't getting into slips for the slip values when they're getting into them for the boats, then we begin to consider relaxing or freezing, if you will, the slip transfer fee. We've gotten there on 20s, got there a while ago. We've gotten there on 25s, and now we believe we're just about there on 28s and 30s. Moving up from 30s, you get to 35s, that percentage of that transfer fee expressed as a percentage of the transacted underground value of that public resource becomes lower and lower and lower as you get toward the bigger boats. Linear. When you get to the really big boats, it's probably 10, 12, 14% is all, where on the smaller boats, it's upwards of 35 or 40%. So that's sort of the operating theory on increasing the transfer fees on a yearly basis, so that we begin to increase that percentage to the point where even on the bigger slips, folks are buying boats for buying boats, not getting into them to watch the investment grow in the municipal resource we call a slip.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you, Brian. Are there any other? Okay. Commissioner Sloan, you're on the subcommittee. Any other comments on the budget proposals?
No, I think it's a good job, and we went through this and talked about it. And I think we're in good shape.
Great. All right. Well, then with that, we move to commission staff communications. Mr. Reedman.
Mr. Chair, nothing from staff this evening. Thank you.
Okay. Anything from the commissioners? No?
I'd just like to make a quick comment. Several of us, Commissioner McIntosh and I, are on the local coastal planning commission, and along with Carl, the three of us have attended several meetings recently about it. The last meeting was a week or so ago, and we made recommendations for changing some of the language in that they're going to present to the Coastal Commission staff over the next month or so, in anticipation of having a document that they can come and present here along with other public venues and other commissions and boards. So sometime later this spring, I think we're going to see a presentation on the agenda from the city staff about the local coastal planning process and where we stand with it. So,
very good. All right. Well, if that is all, I would ask for a motion to adjourn. One. The second, and I will, all in favor say aye. Aye. Thank you. Good night.